was a good start. Yes, natural assets. I want to get into this. That's actually the key thing that I want to get everybody apprised of, the latest that is going on that front. So I'm going to actually, after talking with Chris last night, I'm going to kind of breeze through the first part of this, which is going to touch on three key issues: the 30 by 30 agenda, the natural asset company agenda, which Eagle Forum helped us stop, and then natural capital accounts. And I know it sounds like a lot, and I will try to break it down for you the best that I can in the time that we have. But let me begin by saying, please pick up our literature. It's free. This is the piece that will tell you a lot more about 30 by 30 that I'm going to have to skip over. Also, conservation easements are very key to understand why you need to oppose these, and this is a very good resource for you. They are trying to implement those at the state level, so it's something to definitely take home and have in your resources. But let me begin first by just giving you a little brief background of my background. I was raised on a ranch in Nevada. Now, if you know anything about Nevada, then you know it is 87% government-owned. The state, 87% government-owned. Our ranch was a typical Nevada ranch. It was a medium-sized ranch for Nevada, 1,100 square miles. Out of that, we only owned 7,000 acres of private deeded land, but we owned the grazing rights and the water rights across all of that land. So what happened to us is, after we purchased the ranch, the U.S. Forest Service filed a claim over every one of our water rights. And then they used their administrative powers, the administrative state, in order to regulate us out of business. So they would cancel a grazing permit, they would suspend a grazing permit, they would reduce the numbers we could put on that grazing permit, and over time it culminated into we were pretty much out of business. In 1991, we bought the ranch in 1978, and that's Dad and I on top of Table Mountain, about 12,000 foot elevation. I was 10 years old. In 1991, we filed the first federal lands grazing takings case ever in the United States. And after 27 years in court, we won every round except the last one, the one that really matters. We actually were awarded $14.4 million for the taking of our property in the claims court. But then at the D.C. Circuit, in front of 3 Eastern judges who have no concept of federal lands grazing, which is very complex, they punted, they bought the federal government's arguments, and they basically kicked our case out on 2 technical issues. And after 27 years in court, said our case was not ripe and we did not have standing. So at the end of the day, we were never compensated, we lost the case, and we lost the ranch. So I tell you this story because I think it's really important for you guys to have that same reference point of what a lot of Americans are going through. Our story is well known, but what happened to us is happening to Americans all across this country. There's stories that are not known. But the administrative state has grown to such a large size, it is overpowering we the people. And there's a reason they're able to do that today where they weren't able to do it in years past. And this is something that our founders really understood, is why property rights matter. When our nation was founded, there was one thing they did that was absolutely essential to we the people controlling our government. And that was, we the people would own the land. And so when you look at the United States, you will see the East was settled with the citizens, the small landowner, whom Jefferson said was the most important part of the state. The small landowner would own the land. You get to the West, and that is when the federal government decided to begin retaining that property. So 50% of the West is currently owned by the federal government. The red that you see in the East is primarily where the government owns the mineral estate, but not the land. But in the West, they own most of the West. And we heard it from the Missouri Attorney General yesterday talk about how it was the early 1900s that things changed in America. Well, that was right after the federal government began retaining the land and kept all this land. Then they had the power. This is what our founders understood, is whoever owns the land controls the nation. And that's why they were insistent that every acre would be sold off to the people. The people would own the land. The people, the individuals were king. The people would control the government. So we have seen a loss in our rights that is equivalent to the amount of land ownership that our federal government owns. So let's fast forward to today. Well, let me first before I go there, I want to tell you something that has stuck with me that my father told me years and years ago. You either have the right to own property or you are property. So let's fast forward to today. In 2001, 6 days into the Biden administration, he signed an executive order which implemented an agenda called 30 by 30. 30 by 30 is an international agenda to permanently protect 30% of the world's lands and oceans by 2030. Now, he slipped in an executive order, and it's Section 216, very in a manner that really was unnoticed by most people. He just said that we are to conserve at least 30% of the lands and oceans in America. That at least is important because what this administration is pursuing is something known as the half-Earth agenda. The belief is we're in a nature crisis, and the only way we can save humanity and species is if we permanently protect 50% of the lands and oceans worldwide. And by permanently protect, what they mean ultimately is no human use. How they sell it to us today is this is about conservation. We must conserve our land. Unfortunately, our schools are being taught this. They're not being taught the importance of property rights. They're being taught that we are in a nature crisis, which is absolutely false. And I'm just going to touch on this briefly and then move on. Rob Gordon with the Heritage, or published a report through the Heritage Foundation, which really dives into this very well. But let me give you one key point out of this. He looked at the land ownership in America and what land is in America. Found that most of the land in America is in forest coverage. In other words, he addressed that question, are we in a nature crisis? And out of this, he found that only 5.3% of America is currently developed. Out of that 5.3%, 2.5% of that is considered open space. So that's city parks, golf courses, large lots. So functionally, only 2.5% of the land mass in the lower 48 states can you consider developed. That's where we have our homes, our churches, our hospitals, our schools, our grocery stores. 2.5%. And there has been no statistical change, significant statistical change, that says that we are in any kind of a nature crisis, and that is changing. In fact, I think he said it would be another 100 years before we would really even tick up into a noticeable point beyond what's currently developed. We're not in a nature crisis. And I'm going to skip through a few of these things so that we can get on to natural assets. But the key thing to understand about 30 by 30, they sell it as conservation. You need to understand it is not about conservation. It is about control. This is how they are getting control of our property. Today in America, 40% of America is owned by the government, local, state, and government. 60% is still owned by the people, but most of that, a lot of that, is covered in federal conservation programs the private lands enrolled in federal conservation programs and conservation easements in perpetuity. And those are two devices that the federal government knows gives them control over that property eventually. So let's talk about the eventually. So as we were tracking the 30 by 30 agenda, In September of 2021, a press release came across our desk, and I looked at it because it was very odd. And it was a proposal that was being pushed by the New York Stock Exchange and a group called the Intrinsic Exchange Group. And they were trying to create something called natural asset companies, NACs for short. Now, what they were doing, one of the most unusual things that they were doing with this is they were trying to create a new asset. So there's no more land, right? We can't make any more land. So to get control of that land, they are devising this new scheme where they are saying there are rights, there are assets that we have not been taking into account. Things like pollination, photosynthesis, the health benefits from being in open space. These, they are saying, are assets that the people have been funding through these conservation programs, through the sustainability agenda, and they're creating these assets that they now have a right to. So they were creating something called a natural asset company, where these new assets could be enrolled in these companies and investors could invest in and profit off of. Now, one of the things to understand, this is a screenshot from the Intrinsic Exchange Group's website. And these are some of the key people pushing for natural asset companies. They're also the entities pushing for the 30 by 30 agenda worldwide. So you have the same people pushing to get people off the land and lose their property rights are the same people positioning to profit off of that. Okay? All right, so this became real October 4th, almost a year ago now, October 4th of 2023. The Security Exchange Commission issued a proposed rule to approve these natural asset companies, the listing on the New York Stock Exchange. Okay? When they did this, they did not issue a press release. They tried to do it very, very quietly. And they gave us 21 days of public comment. In 45 days, they were going to issue the final decision to approve these. Now, thankfully, we'd been working with Senator Ricketts. We met him when he was Governor Ricketts of Nebraska, because he was our leader on 30 by 30 to oppose. And we had already sat down with him and unfolded this agenda for him. And he had a letter already prepared to go. So when they issued this notice, he fired off his letter. That was key, because we needed to send the signal, this is not going to happen quietly. They were trying to get it done quietly. This is not going to happen quietly. And of course, we got busy alerting all the people that we could. And I will tell you, one of the best phone calls we received during that whole campaign of trying to stop this came from Chris. And Cindy, my executive director, Eagle Forum executive director in Texas, I had given her my number. And she called me and she said, Margaret, Eagle Forum is going to get in this fight because property rights is a family issue. Yeah. And this is one of those times when it's like, thank goodness, because there is nothing that beats the power of a group of organized, intelligent, and active women. And so I was thrilled to get that phone call. So let me tell you, I'm going to try and skip over a little bit of this as well, but I do want to point out a few things that are critical that you need to understand that they were trying to do. So what the SEC rules said is, first off, things like our national parks could be enrolled in natural asset companies for others to profit off of. Okay, that was in Exhibit 3. Then it said management authority over the assets enrolled in a natural asset company would be given to the investors. So now, who is managing the national parks? The Rockefeller Foundation, Bill Gates, China, or the National Park System? Things that also could be enrolled in these were things like conservation easements in perpetuity. So the land trust, the environmental land trust, could enroll the conservation easement into these natural assets companies with or without the landowner's consent. And finally, Exhibit 5 explicitly said foreign investors were invited to invest in a natural asset company. And one of the interviews that I did was with a financial expert, and he said, look, this is the equivalent of China being able to take over this country without a fight. And he was right. Thankfully, and I will tell you, the reason we stopped this is because God did not want them to do this. So by November 25th, we had 23 state financial officers, 25 attorney generals, and the Natural Resource Committee chairman initiate an investigation into this so that the New York Stock Exchange withdrew their application to create these, and the rule went away. That was an incredible moment, and if you need a reminder of whether or not God is actively working on behalf of our country, I want you to remember this story, because he absolutely is. There's no other way to explain how that was stopped. I want to point out one thing that was on the Intrinsic Exchange Group's website that you should also remember. This has now been scrubbed from their website. They are going to come back and try to do this again. In fact, they're already lobbying Congress. They've already done a lot of PR to try and come back with this concept, so be aware of it. But they said on their website, yet producing these essential goods and services. So those are the environmental services, the ecosystem services, the monetization of these natural assets, pollination, photosynthesis. They said, yet producing these essential goods and resources and managing resources wisely is as valuable or perhaps more valuable than food production. All right, now to our current problem. At the same time that the Intrinsic Exchange Group was working on creating natural asset companies, the White House was working on a similar strategy. Its short name is SEED, but it's a national strategy for environmental economic decisions. And in January of 2023, they finalized this national strategy. And what they are planning to do is create a new line item on the federal budget called natural capital accounts. And the assets that will go into this are those natural processes, the monetization of these natural processes. Now, let me back up a little bit and just say, why should these things not be considered property? Property is easy to understand. Property is something you can contain and you can exclude others from. This is neither. Pollination, photosynthesis, you can't exclude people from having that. That's why it's never been owned, and it never should be owned. But whoever tries to own it is going to be able to control not only our land, but the people. That is what they are trying to put on the federal balance sheet. As they do that, they are claiming ownership of it. And I know, I hate when I have to get to this point because I have to tell you it gets worse. But let me, I'm going to skip over this. But let me fast forward to April. April of this year, they released a press release which showed really what they plan to put in this category, in this line item, the natural capital accounts line item. And so they have 4 categories, and they have done these pilot test accounts of how they will come up with the value that will go in these 4 test pilot accounts. So why do they have to come up with a value and a whole methodology? Because when you're creating a value for something like a natural process, it's not created like everything else is in our capitalistic market. It's not consumer driven. The value isn't set because you as the consumer decide I will pay X and the seller says I will sell it Y. The value for natural assets is created by bureaucrats sitting in a room deciding the air you breathe is worth X and the air I breathe is worth Y, which means the value changes depending on who's sitting in the White House. So this is one of the reasons Utah Treasurer Marlo Oaks got so invested and involved in the natural asset company fight, because he understood when you put these subjective values into the marketplace, you create unreal market distortions and chaos in our financial markets. That's one of the key dangers with this. Well, they're doing it through these pilot test accounts. So they have 4 pilot test accounts is what they've released. One is for land, one is for water, one is for air, and one is the environmental services. We've been talking about the environmental services. That's these natural assets that they're trying to monetize for the first time. But what was most alarming to me, reading through this, is their press release said this little clip right here. It points out that there are 32 trillion, that private property in America is worth $32 trillion. And that's the equivalent of 30% of the US net assets. Now, what's interesting is you always have to read the government documents with the question, what aren't they telling us? So what I would have expected to be in here was the value of the federal lands. They don't give us the value of the federal lands, only the value of the private lands. And then they say that accounting for natural assets like land on the nation's balance sheet is critical. Omitting them would dramatically underestimate U.S. wealth. They don't say federal land. They say land. So we have to assume they mean both. And we can know that that's a valid assumption because the document they link that explains how they get to these numbers, in its conclusion it says, our results underscore the potential importance of private land as a quantitatively significant asset on our national balance sheet. They are planning to put your home, my home, on the federal balance sheet as a U.S. asset. Why? Well, I think Senator Ricketts probably nailed it the first time we talked about this, and he said, well, it's collateral. They need the security. They need to raise the debt ceiling. They need more collateral. You know, sometimes when I tell people this, it's like it's so unbelievable. They don't know what to do with this. But I want to tell you, we're not that far away from Marxism. And we have to, I just finished Margaret Thatcher's autobiography. And she came into power at the moment in history where she had to undo mounds of socialism in Britain. And I had forgotten that when she came into power, Rolls-Royce had been nationalized, British Airways. And she had to unravel that and get them all back into private ownership and the government out of that. We're not that far away from that here in America. And I know, depending on the outcome of the election, this agenda will be on a fast track depending on who wins, or it will be stopped. So this is key. I mean, this is a key moment in history. And, you know, I hate always being the one that comes in and scares everybody. And I'm going to skip through this. I need to wrap this up for you guys. But I will be here to help answer questions. The key thing to understand, I think, we have to have a plan if we win, and we have to have a plan if we lose. We have a really good plan if we win. And I was in D.C. twice this month working on that. And we have great partners back there, big partners, serious players that are 100% committed to stopping this agenda. So I feel pretty good about what we can get done if we win. But if we lose, we cannot lose hope. And we have to have a plan for that too. And I echo what Alex said yesterday, which is the fight will be at the state and the local level. And we have some ideas on what can be done at the state and local level to defend against this agenda, and I'm happy to talk about that. But let me go ahead and wrap this up on this note. First, remember, every one of us is placed specifically in a time and place in history by God for a purpose. So if you are here in this time, as we all are, which we find very troubling, we need to understand that's an honor. It's an absolute honor because He has picked us to be warriors for His cause at such a troubling time. So do not despair, do not fear. We are blessed. We are blessed to be here, to be in this fight, and to be able to fight for Him at this point in time. And then I will leave you with one more very wise saying from my dad, which he said, "You only have the rights you are willing to defend." Thank you.